Cool.
Sorry about that.
So again, I'm Robert. I'm from the University of Washington, I'm instructor there, and been involved in mostly industrial forestry is what my primary work really is. My dissertation is on tree growing space efficiency in Douglas fir and Western hemlock industrial plantations. However, I have a little bit of a soft spot for agriculture, agroforestry, permaculture, sort of those alternative sort of things. So this isn't what I've personally studied on a professional level, but I find it fascinating and really interesting, and this is what I spend a lot of my free time doing. I've chosen shiitake for today for a variety of reasons. But those of you who are here in person, you'll get to see the magazines being passed around. Notice that there are lots of other species as well, things like oyster mushrooms, you may or may not be familiar with, reishi. So everything from culinary mushrooms to very medicinal mushrooms, relatively cheap mushrooms to very, very pricey, expensive mushrooms. Again, depending on how much time and effort you want to invest. I think shiitake is a really good balance between being a little bit difficult, but the return is a lot better versus something that's really easy, like an oyster that maybe has a lesser return. Especially with regards to forestry, I think shiitake is more relevant. So I think the majority of us here are landowners, or at least advised landowners. Who here can say that we're really good at managing every single square foot of our property and we really are on top of it all? Anybody? Anybody brave enough to say, I know every square foot and I'm keeping it PCT'd and pruned? And probably not, right? And I'd say almost everybody, if not everybody who's involved in forestry has a little patch of land that they've let go a little scrubby and has some junky trees and probably isn't really fulfilling the goal that they want, either something that's been cut and it allowed some ingrowth to happen, that sort of thing. Something I'm passionate about is making sure that folks have motivation to actually go out in their woods and engage with it and actually do active management, do that PCT instead of just letting it go, because you're going to end up with a better result. You're going to be more ingrained with what's going on with your land and your forest. And I think shiitake mushrooms, or mushrooms in general, are a great way to motivate you to actually go out there, take out your small diameter wood, prune out your big leaf maple stump sprouts to a few stems left, and not just have that be a sink, but potentially something that generates funds for you at the same time. So who thinks that they could take this right here to a lumberyard and make a whole bunch of money off of it? Probably not, right? Most of us are going to do what with this? We're going to leave it in the woods. It's going to rot if we even bother to cut it one way or another. This is just a little junky hunk of alder. However, if we decide to take the time and it turns out to be worth it for us, we can turn this log here into about that many mushrooms, if not more. Shiitake mushrooms, depending on the exact cultivar, essentially, can be worth anywhere between $5 and $20+ per pound. And you can expect to get maybe around 5 pounds from a log from its lifetime, probably not quite that much from a log this small. There's a lot of different considerations. Sort of the standard is going to be a log more like this one that you see here. This is an alder log that is about 10 years old now. This has thoroughly spent itself. So you can expect the lifespan of a typical log to be around 5 years. This one is thoroughly done, and you can see it's pretty much just turning back into soil at this point. So this about 3 to 4 feet long by about up to maybe 12 inches or a little less is considered an ideal log, an ideal bolt, we would call it, for mushroom production. I personally am a little more partial to the smaller stuff. You know, I can lift this up with one hand. This is alder, which is pretty darn light. You can also have the same thing with big leaf maple. It's a little bit heavier, but depending on the type of mushroom management you want to do and how intensive you want to be, you might be picking up every single one of your logs once or twice a year, dunking them in a large pool of water like a stock tank overnight, and then pulling them back out. So when you're moving a whole lot of these around, I encourage people at the end to lift up that 4-foot log, 3-foot log, and see if you'd want to move about 500 of those in a couple of days. So I'm partial to the smaller logs. I think those are more accessible and something that, you know, you can throw this in the back of your truck and fill up your truck bed pretty quickly versus these take a little more planning, a little more muscle and oomph to get moving around. So on the flip side of that, you can also use relatively small stuff. I wouldn't encourage anybody to bother with this sort of thing, but these are samples. So at the end of this, these will be free for anybody to take, this pile here. And you might get some shiitake mushrooms off of it. Again, there's kind of a trade-off between the size of it, moving it around. This is obviously very easy to move around, but you're really only going to get maybe a couple of mushrooms off of this. So not practical on a financial scale. Okay, I guess I'll back up a little bit. You're not probably going to get rich growing shiitake mushrooms. That's not going to be your sole source of income. However, again, if you have a stand where you think it might be worthwhile to PCT, you're on the fence about it. Do I really want to go out there in the rain and put my chaps on and get my saw started? This might be something that motivates you to actually get out there and push you over that edge to actually do something. So where do I want to? I guess I will go ahead and move on to a little bit of a demo of how you would inoculate these logs. And I want to say that this is also something that is very low cost barrier to entry. You can get a kit and get started, do a few dozen logs at speed, without wasting your time per se, depending on the tools you use, for around $100 or so. So it's very low investment. It's something you can try out. If you have kids or grandkids, it's something that can be fun as well. But it does take a little bit of a turnaround. So it takes about at least a year for most strains before you're going to get your first mushrooms. So it's a little bit of work up front, but then for the most part, you're really just leaving them alone. And you'll either walk out there and get mushrooms, or if you want to be more hands-on and encourage them to fruit when you want them to, you can do that moving the logs in and out of water thing. But I will go ahead and demonstrate just the quick process of inoculating a few holes. You might want to protect your eyes a little bit. I'll just do a little bit of this. So most of us, when we think of drilling holes, we're going to think of like a typical handheld electric drill, right? That is absolutely not the way you want to go unless you're doing like literally one log. What you would want to do is get this tool. For those of you who don't recognize it, this would be an angle grinder, the actual electric tool. And then all of these have been provided, either purchased or generously donated from Field and Forest Products in the Midwest. And they sell an angle grinder adapter. And I'll pass this around, or you're welcome to look at it once I have it unplugged, and I'm sure it's safe. But this is a drill bit specifically made for drilling wood at speed, because you're drilling hundreds or thousands of holes, depending on how many you're going to do. So if you used a hand drill, right, you can imagine how long that's going to take compared to this. And you'll see in just a moment how quickly you can do a whole bunch of holes. So it's going to be a little bit loud, not too bad. There may be saw chips flying, so shield your eyes if you're concerned. You can see that's a lot quicker. So again, depending on the scale at which you want to do that, you can make a whole bunch of holes in your log really, really rapidly. Following that, all you're going to want to do is, when you're working with Field and Forest Products or various other companies, depending on the scale you're going to do, you're going to have two different sources of your mushroom seed, essentially. What's your mushroom spawn, is what you would call it. It's going to come in either a brick like this, which is just sawdust of the correct type. So shiitake needs hardwoods, for instance, which has been inoculated with that mushroom. So basically this has the plant part of the mushroom. The mushroom that we see and think of as a mushroom is really just the fruiting body. So this has the rest of the apple tree, for instance, inside of it. The other option is you can also get dowels, so little pieces of wood that have been inoculated as well. Those are a little more expensive, a little more practical for small scale. If you want to do a whole bunch, this is a good way to do it. So you'd take this, you'd have it in a reasonably sterile bucket. I'm doing a little Wild West today. And you're going to take your inoculation tool, which is just basically a little hole with a plunger in it. So you can see it has a little void in there, and when I press that, it's going to push it back out. So I take a little sawdust, get it into my tool. It's, maybe a thimble worth approximately. I'm going to just set that there. Then you're going to come up to your log, stick it in the hole just a little bit, press your plunger. It's a little hard to see, but this has now been filled with a little bit of sawdust. You do that for all of your holes, and then either at the same time if you have help, or once you're done filling that one. There's another couple of methods you can do for this. I elected to use these little styrofoam caps for speed, and so I didn't have to deal with what the other option is, which plugs it up. So that what it's trying to do, you're adding the mushroom, you're infecting this piece of wood with that mushroom, and then you want to try to seal it off and protect it from other species of mushrooms. Shiitake, there's a variety of aggressiveness, basically success against other mushrooms, but on average, I would say a shiitake is going to be less aggressive than native mushrooms that might be floating through the air, right? So like turkey tail is a very common competitor. The other option, if you want to avoid using excess plastic, or you just don't like the look of it, whatever, is you can take wax, either beeswax or any other kind of wax, and just dab a little bit of hot wax on there. And again, you're just trying to basically recreate the seal that the bark would have on that log. And you fill all these up. set it aside, keep it in a moist and humid area, and in about a year, potentially more, you're going to start getting mushrooms. There are a few considerations as well, aside from just size and ease of moving the logs around, that you need to think about when you're choosing logs that you're going to use. One of them, so in general, would you expect to get more mushrooms from, let's say that this was even bigger, like double the size that it currently is. Which would you expect to give you more mushrooms, the big log or the smaller log? Probably the bigger one, right? However, that's not necessarily the case. It could be, but more important than the actual total volume of the log is the volume of sapwood within the log. For shiitakes and many other mushroom species, they are actually only going to be able to use the sapwood, right? That most recent wood within the log. So you could have a really big log laying on the ground, right? And people will often do this. A really big maple or alder, for instance, falls in their backwoods. They'll inoculate it and they'll get a lot of mushrooms off of it. But you're really only getting maybe this much sapwood from like a 3-foot diameter tree. So it's a trade-off. So it's not necessarily worth it to pick a larger and an older piece of wood. You're looking at the sapwood more than the heartwood. The heartwood is generally useless to the shiitake mushrooms. Okay. Another thing I like about shiitakes, so they are reasonably highly valuable. So again, it's a good balance. Oyster mushrooms aren't necessarily as valuable as shiitakes. These aren't nearly as valuable as like a reishi, but they're a good balance between difficulty and value. The other nice thing about shiitakes is that you can dry them. So these are very easy to put in your oven on a low setting, put a fan over them. I've even just put them loose on a plate in my fridge, and just that cold air keeps them from going bad, which allows you to not have to sell them or use them immediately. So shiitakes are a good option in that respect. There's also sort of more and more, especially I'd say in the last 10 years, people are aware of shiitakes. They're not necessarily as afraid of them as people might have been 20 years ago. So shiitakes are a really good option. The other thing is, so each of these 4 bags is a different type. So these are all shiitakes, but they're all different types of shiitakes. So in the same way you have a red delicious apple or a gala apple, each of these is going to have slightly different characteristics, different trade-offs. Some of these are going to produce a less valuable mushroom, but more quickly, maybe more overall mushroom, maybe more reliably, versus others might be a little less reliable, but they produce a really, really valuable mushroom that might be double for the individual or weight of mushroom. Yeah, so they're a really fun thing. I encourage you also to come up and see how, so this is all that your mushroom's gonna end up turning into. It's just nice composty soil. So people will often like make garden borders with this. And like I said, this is pretty much spent, but it's possible you'll get a mushroom popping off of that. You're also welcome, again, to take any from this small pieces pile. These are all totally welcome for you to take. Take a mushroom as well if you want. Again, I can't promise there won't have been slugs crawling over them or hiding underneath them. So yeah, they're a very interesting thing. So when I first set this up a little over a year ago, so at the UW, I have a project going with students primarily to give them research experience. We've inoculated about 400 logs, and we're comparing the different cultivars, right? So the red delicious versus the gala, as well as comparing red alder and big leaf maple. So red alder around here is sort of the standard. The standard in the rest of the world, essentially, primarily like the East Coast and Japan, would be oak. So we don't really have oak. Oak is a nice density. You're going to get a lot of really high quality mushrooms per your weight on oak. We don't have a lot of oak. Our Gary oak would be suitable. But if you started cutting down what's left of our Gary oak for us, for shiitake mushrooms, people might be up in arms. So big leaf maple might be a reasonable alternative. So far, the word is that they're a little less predictable. So you don't know when you're going to get mushrooms as much as with the alder. The hope, though, is that you would get more mushrooms or higher quality mushrooms off of this because it's a denser wood. Alder is going to break down and be done in maybe 3 to 5 years. Big leaf maple might take a little longer than that. The other thing is that the spawning run, so the time from inoculation to when you get your first mushrooms or significant amounts of mushrooms, looks like it's probably significantly longer in big leaf maple than it is in red alder. So those are some of the considerations we're looking at. Okay, those magazines I was passing around are from Field and Forest Products, which is one of a few different places that you can get spawn equipment, that sort of thing. Questions?
So my property, I have no facilities out there.
Right.
Leave it out in the wild, no humidity kind of place.
Yeah, so the primary problem that we have here compared to like the East Coast, for instance, is that summer drought. So depending on the humidity of your local environment, you might want to go back out there, for instance, and spray it with a hose, especially the first year. If the log dries out too much, the shiitake will die and something else will replace it. However, where my logs live is right next to a little stream, so that's less important. The other thing you can do is if you'll at least, cover it with something. So Field and Forest Products actually sell tarps to help try to keep moisture in, for instance. It's a delicate balance, though. You don't want to encourage mold, for instance, as well. However, if you're willing to kind of play the numbers game, yeah, you can pretty much just leave them out there. The other thing is that it's generally better if you're actually going to do this for something other than fun, right? You want to have them in sight. So these mushrooms are probably, I'm going to say, 4 or 5 days old. And in another 4 or 5 days, these will be goo. They will be done. They will be gone. So you really have to have them at some reasonable place, like along the side of your driveway where you'll notice them. Otherwise, they're either going to go through their life cycle before you notice them, or slugs, squirrels, whatever other critters are going to come and get them first. Yeah.
On your post log that you're inoculating.
Yes.
You want something that is freshly cut, a year old, 2 years, obviously not 10 years.
Yes. So very good point. I should have mentioned that. So a freshly cut log. So two things. One, the best log that you can get is a tree that does not currently have the leaves on it. Shiitake is going to be hardwood only. You're not going to want to use a conifer, for instance, an evergreen. For shiitake, it's not a suitable match. For these deciduous trees that you're going to want to do shiitake on, you want to take them when there's no leaves on the tree. Anytime from leaf fall in the fall to before the leaves come out in the spring is a great time to harvest that tree. A freshly harvested tree, though, or before I get to that, you can use, so let's say that one of these trees fell right now without the leaves coming down. You can still inoculate that, but you're going to have a much less total amount of mushroom, potentially even quality of mushroom as well, because a lot of the nutrients found in that tree are in the leaves at that point. Once the leaves have come off the tree, that tree is storing it inside of its wood in itself, and you're going to be able to get a larger amount of mushrooms and theoretically higher quality as well. The other thing is that when a tree is freshly cut, and the reason that all of our living trees aren't covered in mushrooms unless they're unhealthy or having problems, they have natural protection from those mushrooms that they're going to try to employ. So generally you want to wait up to around a month, maybe a little more, depending on if it's cold, depending on how healthy the tree was, and a variety of other factors that you should look up for the individual tree for your sake. So like something like a walnut naturally has a lot of protection within it, something like an alder less so, but you do have to give it a period of waiting, essentially, where one, you're trying to protect it from being colonized by more aggressive mushrooms like a turkey tail. Two, you're waiting for those defenses to sort of fade away before you try to put your shiitake in. So around a month is a good rule of thumb. Yeah. Yeah.
Not a question, but I've seen dried shiitake being sold as mushroom jerky at Costco.
Oh, right. Yeah. So shiitake in the US has an interesting history. So it's been done in East Asia for a very long time. I believe it was around 20, maybe even 30 years ago now. The USDA was interested in bringing shiitake to the US, but they were a little worried about it essentially becoming an invasive species. So they've done a lot of trialing with it. It can escape a little bit, but it's not to the extent where it's going to cause problems. And since that has happened, so the USDA found, all right, fine, green light it, bring it into the States, start producing it. And it's really partially through a lot of our, what's the word I want to use, non-Native American populations, not Native American, but non-born in America populations. People have brought shiitake and shiitake culture into the US. And me growing up, I never really thought of shiitake as anything all that exotic. People who are older might think of it as something more exotic, but I'd say, especially moving forward, there's a lot of different applications of shiitakes and people are familiar with it. They would have no problem buying shiitake, at least maybe in somewhere as culturally diverse as the West Coast. But so there's definitely an emerging market. You're definitely going to be able to sell these, especially if you're willing to do that drying process. And then there's basically no rush for you to get them sold as well. But yeah, great farmer's market product. I encourage you to, next time you're around a farmer's market, go check them out. And if you have a local mushroom farmer, there's a lot of really interesting ones. And again, don't just focus on shiitakes necessarily, but look at some of your other options as well. Maybe depending on the type of tree species you have. So reishi, for instance, is one that, again, has a really, really high value, is pretty difficult to produce. But if you have a conifer-dominated stand, for instance, reishi is something that's going to grow on like a western hemlock and might be more suitable for the wood that you tend to have. Yeah.
What about putting the logs end into the ground
or into sand?
So that can help with moisture. However, you're also going to increase the risk of introducing other fungus or bacteria as well. And that also brings up one other thing, which is how do you arrange these? There's a variety of different methods. You can basically like run a wire and lean them up against that. You can do this, which is called basically a crib. You would call it. Part of the considerations are when you're first, so you've inoculated it and you're waiting for the mushroom to do its run, basically to colonize that log. At that point, you're going to want to generally have them laying on the ground because your number one concern at that point is moisture. So you want to make sure that you preserve moisture. Then later on, you're doing this kind of stacking primarily to make easy picking. So if you have this stacked up tightly together, you're going to end up with mushrooms in these cracks. They're going to be deformed. You're not going to really be able to get to them. So this cribbing or other various methods of stacking them up are primarily for you to be able to see the mushrooms and detect that you have them together, but also to be able to get them and have them not be deformed or cruddy. Yeah, sticking them in the ground is an option, but you're definitely going to have maybe, let's say, an extra 10% of your logs that potentially fail due to problems. It probably depends on the sand. If it's native sand, that's, you know, right there. But if you bring in fresh sand, maybe at least for a while, it wouldn't be an issue. I'd say you're more likely to have success with more sterile methods, such as maybe putting a tarp down, for instance, and wrapping it up. But again, you got to manage moisture, hit the right amount. You know, you might have to open and close the tarp sort of thing. It really depends on, you can be really successful and, you know, a little bit anal about how you're managing them and be really, really high success rate. But if that time isn't worth it to you, you can also just throw a whole bunch of logs out there and keep an eye out for mushrooms. Yeah.
Mushrooms take up contaminants from the soil, especially like compared to veggies.
Not from the soil, but potentially from the log. I'm not familiar with that ever being something that people were concerned about. But yeah, if you have a tree, for instance, that you have access to, let's say someone's in an urban area, I wouldn't necessarily trust it. They definitely do take up those contaminants. I would say in any of your lands, unless you're, you know, living on a super fun site or anything like that, trying to grow a forest, I wouldn't generally be too concerned. Any other thoughts, questions? Again, please feel free to come pick a mushroom or two to take home. They're really enjoyable. And then also, please, again, feel free to take this. Yeah.
You mentioned that they go through their cycle really quickly.
Yeah.
5 days, did you say?
It really depends. So if it's raining, if it's really humid, they could grow really, really quickly. And that does bring up one other thing, which is when you pick the mushroom. So the most high quality mushroom is going to be when the cap is still folded over on the edges. So these are just barely past. See how the edges are sort of starting to flare up a little bit? These are just past their very best point. When they're still folded up just a little bit, more like this one, but even a little bit before this one. That's when they're considered ideal. Past that point, they're not bad, but they're less meaty. They're starting to get a little bit more watery kind of volume sort of thing. They're still going to be really nice mushrooms, but also if you're considering doing this specifically to sell them, you want to make sure you get those at the best possible moment.
Do they store better off the?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. So these will continue to develop as they sit. And again, they're already sort of past their prime just a little bit. If you pick them, either use them as soon as you possibly can. They're not going to like develop or get better as they sit, or dry them as soon as you can. And when I say dry them, not necessarily to like a snap powdery point, but they'll be kind of like beef jerky a little bit. Yeah.
Following up on her question, as a seller, are there any other liabilities to be concerned about?
Yeah, so that's one other thing that I should mention about these as well. Again, it's entirely possible that your log will fail. So you better be darn sure that what you have is shiitake coming off of it. As you can see, there's a lot of variability that even just within these shiitakes. So be really sure that you're not eating whatever little brown mushroom happens to pop off of your log. In general, so like that, those magazines that were passed around reference those pictures. So there's going to be even cultivar, a little bit of variation, you know, how much cracking, what's the exact color, how exactly big is the mushroom, that sort of thing. But generally, shiitakes are reasonably easy to identify as being a shiitake. Yeah, but you definitely don't want to sell someone a nondescript little brown mushroom in the farmer's market. You could literally kill someone. Yeah.
Any issue doing stuff like this inside a wetland management zone?
No, I would say no problems at all, as long as, again, maybe you're putting up informational signs, whatever liability step you need to take, if it's like a publicly accessible zone, and people go, oh, look, there's shiitake mushrooms, and people pick them and maybe pick something that's not a shiitake thinking it was. But if it's in your personal backyard, I'd say that's good. Again, you're balancing That increased humidity maybe reduces your chances of the mushroom drying out too much, but you're also probably having more competition around as well for that particular mushroom. Turkey tail in particular is one that's a little bit of a bane of my existence. So that's the one I typically think of.
Marketable, right?
Turkey tail is too. I would say I'd rather have a pound of shiitakes than a pound of turkey tail, though. Yeah, Patrick is also an absolute expert in this, so anything that he thinks is worthwhile to add.
I did want to add, don't eat shiitake raw. 20% of people have like a skin reaction, unless you know you're not going to. But it's better cooked.
Right.
But I did,
and you get nutrition from it cooked as well.
So great information. And then not to apply competition at all. But WC's been running some trials for the last 5 years, and we're about to release a publication that'll encapsulate a lot of this information for folks. So I can maybe share that with Margaret or Kelsey or something to share out with the group. It just got approved for this week.
Cool.
So that'll be like a hobbyist guide that has all this stuff written down. Pretty much everything you said and some more.
It's a pretty fun thing to get into. Yeah. And again, you can make a little bit of money on the side too. Any other questions, comments?
Before we get Patrick's in writing, how do we know when it's time to douse the logs in water?
So that is a little bit up to you. So basically what the professionals, the production people do is they'll douse it when they want to encourage that log to fruit. You can do it also annually. So like Patrick, they did it during the spawn run phase to make sure that the logs were moist enough to continue to inoculate. But essentially what you'll do is dunk that log and then expect that roughly a week after you undunk it, you're going to get your mushrooms if you've been successful. Yeah. Yeah. I'll let you say anything else, but we're going to pile up into vehicles to go to an agroforestry site. I can fit a couple